everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of The Climate of Sport Ask Me Anything with me, Claire Poole. Thank you for joining me again this week. I'm really interested to chat about the question that's come in this week. I actually wrote a piece for Forbes about it as well, stemmed actually off the back of this anonymous question that came through on email. And this week, what we're going to be discussing about what sport's doing around recycling and whether recycling is worthwhile, which is a very interesting question. Monday of this week was Global Recycling Day, which is the 18th of March every year. And obviously, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to recycling and sport. So let's dig into this week's question. Again, what is sport doing around recycling, and is recycling worthwhile? So like everything we talk about on this podcast and when it comes to environment, sustainability and sport, there's no short and simple answer to this question. At its root, yes, of course, recycling is worthwhile and sport is engaging in a lot of activities around this area. However, what I'll talk to you a little bit about in this episode is how it's not always quite as simple as that. And actually, I think I'll start at the end and work my way back, even though please do listen on to the end. But I just think it's helpful to frame a lot of this starting at the end. So I think we are unified in our agreement that recycling is crucial to tackle the current levels of waste we've created. So it's not enough to carry on business as usual. This linear recycling economy of production and consumption and waste, safe in the knowledge that whatever you are holding in your hand right now, drinking from, will end up being recycled. And actually, environmentalists fear that if people buy products thinking everything will be recycled and reused, it enables them to keep consuming at a very high level with a clean conscience. So this is obviously part of what's happening in the European Union and other places globally where labelling is very important, why they're cracking down on greenwashing. Again, whilst we like to hope that everyone is doing it with the best possible intentions, a lot of larger consumer brands are putting sustainable, recyclable and compostable, biodegradable. And we know from research that what it says and what that actually means in real life are not always the same. And we're seeing a crackdown in that area. So we know that wider transformation has to happen now for a true circular economy where hopefully that waste is not created in the first place. We see sport as a real potential influencer of this area, sport, especially professional sport, but also grassroots sport participation. When you think about apparel, equipment, food and drink, materials, signage, equipment, overlay, the sport industry is a big purchaser. Therefore, it can influence decisions, it can be a role model, and it can play a key role in this shift. Annie Leonard said there's no such thing as a way. And when we throw anything away, it must go somewhere. And I think that's helpful for us to think about as we go about our day, but also as we procure goods and services and materials through sport, thinking about what is the end of life for this product? Where is it going to end up? How many times can I use it? And that, I think, is a really helpful way to start thinking about things. So I mentioned in an article I wrote recently, circular economist Harold Friedel, who's based in the Netherlands, and he is an influence in this area. He's a circular economist himself. And although we're used to hearing about reduce, reuse, recycle, we're very familiar with the 3 Rs. There's been a lot of campaigning around that and a lot of awareness raising and visibility. Harold Friedel and a lot of other people with a similar mindset to him talk about many more Rs that we need to think about. So first of all, rather than thinking about it as waste, we need to think of it as resource stewardship. So essentially, if you are purchasing any goods or materials, thinking about it as you stewarding those research rather than you buying it for a purpose and throwing it away can be a helpful mindset shift around some of this work. The other R's that he encourages us to think about is to reconnect both to nature and ourselves, to refuse if we can, to rethink what we need and how long we need it for and whether we do actually need it. Redesign. So again, are we buying certain goods and materials because that's the way it's always been done, but or can we redesign the way we work and the way things happen in order for us either not to need certain products or for us to enable them to have a much longer life? Can we reduce? Very importantly, we're very used to that. Can we reuse? Also, I think quite familiar. In our podcast last week, we spoke about sustainability at temporary sport events and the sustainability around that, and infrastructure and overlay came up around that reuse. If you're creating anything, how can you avoid it being single use or just used a couple of times and then thrown away? How can you extend the life of it for as long as possible? Then the idea of resharing, repairing, refurbishing. So again, how can we ensure that any materials that can't perhaps be reused or can't be redesigned, how can we either reshare them with someone else who needs them or another organisation that needs it? Can we repair things to give them a longer life? Can we refurbish them either to create a longer life or instill a new life into the product? Can it be remanufactured, repurposed, again with a similar mindset of refurbishing and repairing? Can we ensure residuals management, or can we then recycle and also recover? So there's a lot of R's to consider there. But again, if you're listening to this and you do procure goods or materials, if you can start thinking about this and instilling this shift within your connection to sport, it will really start to make a change. And I think this behavior change and this shift towards the circular economy is what's needed from people who have purchasing power and the ability to make different decisions when it comes to goods and materials and procuring of those goods and materials and what they're needed for, how long they're needed for, and whether they are actually needed at all. Just for some stats, it's always helpful to throw in, the UN reports that plastics are the largest, most harmful and most persistent fraction of marine litter, accounting for 85% of total marine waste. Plastic packaging is the reason for the majority of plastic pollution, which is 36%. So when we think about plastic packaging, we are probably thinking about good food and drink packaging. Then when it comes to plastic waste, in terms of what actually happens to it at the end of its life, currently the UN reports that 46% of plastic waste ends up in landfill, 22% becomes litter, 17% is incinerated, and 15% is collected for recycling. However, because of issues with what collected for recycling, probably down to things like contamination or products being interfered with, less than 9% actually is recycled after losses, according to a UN report. So again, this is why there's no simple answer to the question about whether recycling is worthwhile, because if we can ensure products end up in the right channels and actually do become recyclable materials and then go on to have an extended life, of course, that's worthwhile. But again, we have to ask the question, how many times with any products could it go into that closed loop system? That means that it's getting to the right place, is then successfully being recycled, is then created into a new product, and then can it be recycled again after that? So we know, for example, aluminium can be recycled forever. We know that a lot of plastic, especially even when they're recycled, they degrade and they can't be recycled as many times. So recycling does play a vital role in the sports industry by minimizing environmental impact, which is why, even though this is a complex issue, we certainly don't want to demonize recycling. We don't want to create an atmosphere where people believe recycling is not worthwhile, because of course it is worthwhile. But I guess the sentiment here is ask the questions when it comes to something that you presume is going to be recycled, or when someone tells you a product is recycled, ask more questions about how easy it is to recycle, whether it's actually recycled, what kind of contamination might prevent recycling, how we ensure it gets to where it needs to go. If it is then recycled, does it mean it can just be recycled once, or does it have a longer life? Is it upcycled? Is it downcycled? Where does it end up, and how long is the eventual life of the product? There are some things, of course, we can't avoid using, even if they have limited recycling ability. But of course, that's always the reason for not doing things. What we want to do is engender an atmosphere of, yes, there is going to be some things we can't do. However, there is also a huge amount that we can actually do. So again, the initial advice before we go into some examples of what sport are doing across different areas, speak to your waste provider, find out what they do with your waste, find out what the emissions are related to, for example, collection, processing, and then end of life. Understand what actually happens. I've heard on a number of occasions, especially where I speak to sport organisations and they talk about bringing the group together. So maybe you're just starting inside your sport organisation to really move to a more systemic effort around sustainability. And you think we're going to have a sustainability group that meets every month and we're all going to have different focus areas. We see a lot of sport organisations doing that now. What that's really helpful with and what that's supporting is understanding how things work. And actually on a number of occasions over the years, I have heard when those groups get together that a lot of interesting information is uncovered. In a number of instances, that whilst people with inside venues or in events were taking the time to separate waste under the apprehension that it was going to be recycled or dealt with by their waste manufacturer, by meeting together and understanding people who are experts on the operational side, who have those relationships, and then see perhaps all of the different segregated waste being dumped into one waste truck and being taken away. The disconnect sometimes between what people expect will happen and what actually happens, and it happens to the best of us. That's why these conversations and getting your entire sport organisation across these efforts is really important. You don't want people doing lots of work with a certain expectation that isn't actually happening. So always question. But also, I guess the caveat to that as well is even when you ask questions and maybe you don't find out the information that you need, or maybe it's not the information you wanted to hear, please don't be paralyzed by not doing things perfectly. So I've had a lot of recent conversations about misinformation and disinformation. And in one of those conversations, climate scientist and communicator Katharine Hayhoe shared some great information and highlighted that those seeking to hamper progress in this area, they don't have the goal to convince people of the disinformation. What all they want to do is prevent action. So by people on the internet saying certain things are a savior or a cause, it's the best thing, it's the worst thing. The majority of the efforts that we're undertaking in this space are a piece of the puzzle. And actually, in regards to people trying to spread disinformation or misinformation, and also there being opposing views about the best way to tackle this work, if it then leads to delay, that essentially is what a lot of organizations are looking to do, because then really any argument is a success if it leads to delay. What we don't need is all of us people on the same side spending too much time not taking the action because we're not sure it's the perfect action when actually we all need to get going. So that's the broad Cliff's notes around some of this work. And then let's just talk about a few different areas that sport is taking action around recycling and the benefits of that. So I'm going to cover food, plastic, apparel and merchandise, and then also carbon fibre. So just starting with food, broadly, we know that when it comes to the emissions created by individuals and organisations globally, the biggest three emitters tend to be energy, transport and food. So again, in terms of energy and transport, although there is obviously a role for recycling there, food is the main one that at an individual level we can have a lot of impact on. And globally, we know 25 to 30% of total food is lost or wasted. The US EPA estimated in 2019 that just under 40,000 tonnes of food waste were created by sports events each year. We know that globally, if food waste were a country, based on its emission, it would be the third biggest country in the world after the US and China in regards to the emissions created by food waste, not just carbon, also methane and other gases. So we know that if we can reduce food waste, that's going to make a big impact when it comes to our environmental footprint. Food waste can obviously happen in two different ways. So a lot of food can be wasted during the preparation and then also by lack of consumption. So we see both at sporting events. We're talking about this in the context of recycling, but actually this probably talks initially more broadly to reducing, in terms of reducing the amount of waste we create during food preparation and also trying to reduce food waste itself, but also thinking, again, sort of broadly into the reuse, I guess, of if food is left over, how can we ensure it is consumed? So efforts are taking place to reduce this across sport, especially we're seeing a lot now of a rise of donating surplus food. We're seeing as well in terms of not allowing that food to go to waste, it going to composting. We see it going from food waste to energy through anaerobic digestions as well. So although recycling is a broad brushstroke for food, I think it all falls into this idea of reduction, reuse, but also recycling, or I guess maybe rather than recycling in this instance, we're talking more about stewarding resources. So platforms now, either at an individual or corporate level, like Too Good To Go and Olio, basically make donating surplus food really easily. Also, with a small amount of work, you usually found food banks in your area where surplus food can be donated to. This has obviously got the benefit of community engagement as well as food reduction, making sure that food, which is a precious resource, goes to the right place. Some examples of that: World Athletics Indoor Championships in Glasgow in 2024, the organisers partnered with a food bank to redistribute their surplus food from the event. Also at the Super Bowl this year, Food Recovery Network, a college student-empowered nonprofit, managed to salvage £4,000 of food from this year's Super Bowl, mainly from things like hospitality, events and others, where high quality food was produced and then not consumed. So as long as that food is donated under sanitary conditions in a certain amount of time, it's good food and it can go to other people who need it. So for sure, if you're not already looking at that, you should be. But then also composting is another way that sports organisations can ensure any food left over, especially from food preparation, can end up not going to waste. And also we're seeing a lot more food waste to energy through things like anaerobic digestion are increasing as well. What we need to instill here is that food is such a precious resource, and we are seeing the climate impact. Agriculture, crops, and farmers a lot. So when we do have these food that's been created, to have it go to waste is completely abhorrent and obviously should be avoided. So certainly food is a big area that you can think about when it comes to the recycling. So reduce, yes, reuse, yes, but also recycling, especially through that food preparation. But apparel and merchandise is one that recycling fits more naturally in terms of what it creates. So when I was starting to look at what's happening in this area, broadly, you have a gut for these things, but obviously we want to highlight really some statistics, if we can, about the creation, how much sport apparel is created or how much merchandise is sold, even in professional sport, even in one sport within one geography. This data and information is incredibly difficult to come across. What's very easy to find is the economic value of the global sport apparel industry. So you can find any number of market research, forecasting and insights organizations that will give you numbers relating to this. One such number by Fortune Business Insight valued the global sport apparel industry at just under $200 billion with a B in 2022 and projects it to grow to nearly $300 billion by 2030. So very, very easy to understand the economic value of this market. Then when we look at sport apparel and its ecological impact, very, very difficult to find substantive figures. More broadly, we can find information about apparel and footwear sectors. So that's not just relating to sport. We're talking about fashion and we're talking about clothes and footwear and apparel across every sector, so not specific to sport. A 2018 report by Qantas quantified that at 8% of worldwide greenhouse gases are responsible through the creation of apparel and footwear. The creation, yes, but also the life of those products in terms of, obviously, when you purchase a product, it has a carbon footprint or an environmental footprint attached to it. But then, depending on the process and the how long you have it for and its processing throughout that life, it can also add to the environmental impact. And then also how long you have it for and where it ends up can impact as well. So apparel and footwear sector account for 8% of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. Comparatively, the commercial aviation sector accounts for 2 to 3% of global energy related emissions. So you can see how big this issue is. And I find this interesting to raise awareness of this because we haven't got a figure about sports apparel, but we do know how big merchandise and apparel is to professional sport. When looking into figures, Liverpool Football Club, who are very progressive in this area and account for their emissions that a lot of other sport organisations either don't or they don't publicly, they include their merchandise emissions, which actually are much larger than the operational emissions of the club across a season, which again, it's not broad empirical data, but it gives us an individual insight for one football club, one sport organisation, and the difference between the impacts on this sector. So we don't want to get too down into the weeds there, but I think it's important to think about this sector more broadly and how we are addressing it as sport. So again, in terms of recycling, what efforts are going on? You probably see all the time a lot of football clubs that have a third kit made out of upcycled ocean plastic. It'll say something like 7 single-use bottles were collected from the ocean and added to this apparel. So we're seeing recycling happen in that way. We're seeing organisations upcycle leftover apparel. So organisations like FDACA and actually some other university-backed innovative hotbeds are doing this, where instead of perhaps seasonal merchandise from a sports organisation or a club going to waste, they're upcycled into new products. What the benefit of this essentially is that you still have the connection to the club logo. We see now a burgeoning market in retro kits, etc. In the future, you can imagine that these upcycled kits will, because of the badge associated with them, retain value. Reuse, so again, avoiding waste by distributing secondhand kits to people. So SOS Kit Aid do this, and actually when I posted out some information about this recently, SOS Kit Aid highlighted the fact that reuse is better because it has a lower footprint than perhaps additional processing around upcycling. even if something is upcycled and additional processing takes place, which increases the emissions of the product, if that is then valued across a lifetime as opposed to being reused for a shorter time and then potentially ending up somewhere else, I don't think it's as black and white as saying one is better than the other. I think ultimately we have to always question, how are we creating value? How are we extending the life of the product? How are we avoiding it eventually ending up in landfill or being incinerated? So I think there's a lot of solutions and they all have incredible value in this space. Other interesting ones, I mentioned there about the third football kits, also NBA India are repurposing discarded underwater fishing nets into basketball nets. So again, taking something out of the ocean and creating value, and also providing these basketball nets for community clubs in India, which is perhaps a resource they wouldn't otherwise have in some cases. So again, it's not just about recycling within the ecosystem, but also taking waste from elsewhere. And the last one, just to mention here, Reaction, which is a societal-based organization from France. They sort of protest against the consumer story that tells us we need shiny, new, highly technical kit, for example, to go into the outdoors. And their members rescue products. They revive them through repair, rebranding, repurpose them, and redistribute them through sale, rental, and donations, and then allocate those profits to regenerate the outdoors. So again, a much more circular model, and sort of a membership model, and a really interesting one to look at. None of these I'm saying are the answer or are the wrong thing to do. I think, again, what we're talking about through this lens is every single one of these different sort of organizations has an incredible value to bring, and we should look at what's right for us. So much great work. We're not going to get into what's better or worse. It really does depend, but essentially, have a think about for you and your sporting organization or where you sit in the market. Are any of these recycling ideas around apparel or merchandise? Are you even thinking about it? Are people working on that? Is there more you could be doing? Ask those questions about what happens to the apparel and merchandise that we create because of our organization. If it's not used, where does it go? If it is used only once or twice, where then does it go? The takeaway here around this recycling is question, question, question. So that's sport apparel and merchandise. Plastics, we know, is one of the biggest issues of our time. Single-use plastic, I should say. The plastic that is gone within 30 seconds of being used and then hangs around for 500 years. So the UK's Environment Agency estimates that major sporting events can generate up to 750,000 plastic bottles at a time. And obviously we know across sport, reduction of single-use plastic bottles and packaging is being prioritised, and that's either being led by sport themselves or enacted into policy. So led by sport themselves, I think day-to-day level, we're seeing, especially in venue-based sport, we're seeing a move away from single-use plastic and into refill stations. We are seeing, for example, aluminium canned water instead of plastic water if refills aren't available. We're seeing reusable bottles being used by tennis players and footballers, broadcasters, etc. We are seeing a change in signage as well. So again, instead of that plastic signage, single-use plastic signage, we're seeing the way that's changing behind the scenes in terms of sport taking action on that. So I think broadly, sport organizations are getting across this and understanding what the benefits are. Then there's great examples of longer term plastics, not single use, but Real Betis, for example, the Spanish football club, partnered recently with an organization to create its new stadium seats from ocean plastic waste. So again, taking something and then repurposing it into something valuable, which will have a much longer life. And also, depending on their model around season ticket holders, that seat will actually, the season ticket holders, become something valuable to them and something they connect with the club. Other examples, Ralph Lauren turned tennis ball cans at the US Open in 2021 into US Open uniforms. So basically the tennis ball can, there's obviously a lot of tennis balls used through major tournaments and they come in these plastic cans. So instead of those going to waste, essentially 560 pounds of that plastic tennis ball can weight were made into 90 pieces of US Open uniforms. Again, naysayers will say, well, that's just a small little activation, isn't it? You're not changing things at scale, which is the case with a lot of these things. But I think, again, let's go back to the fact that sport has a duty to reduce its operational impact, but we cannot forget about the influence that sport can have by doing things, even if they're small scale, talking about them, communicating them, showing a use case and encouraging that action in other areas. So again, we're always balancing sports operation impact versus the influence sport organizations can have as a microphone, as a mouthpiece, as a role model, and as the source of telling these stories and socializing the idea that this is normal. So please, again, don't get bogged down in the fact that some of these may be smaller activations. It really is about the power of the brands behind them and what's happening and how we can use these use cases to drive further action. Then on the other side of that, around plastics, for example, we are now seeing policy being enacted in this area. So for the 2024 Olympic Games, the City of Paris banned single-use plastic. Another point, New York City Council has enacted legislation requiring operators of sports stadiums and arenas to allow attendees to bring refillable beverage containers into events. So we know, especially for some events, this poses a health and safety risk, but for the majority of sport, depending on which sport you're working in, the use of reusables is probably very easy to do. And especially if you can instill and enact refillable stations, sports stadium events are making these changes and they're making moves. And also we can reduce the impact even of the single-use vessels, even if you move to, for example, it's more solid plastic that can be reused 100 or 200 or 300 times. If you would put in refill stations and people are allowed to bring their own reusable, but also as long as there's not a health and safety issue, you can then reduce a lot of costs, but also improvements on sustainability as well. The last one I just wanted to mention here, because it is used across a lot of sport equipment, is carbon fiber. Initially you think, is this quite niche? But actually 50% of Summer Olympic sport, 90% of Winter Olympic sports use some equipment that uses carbon fiber. And actually at a participation level, we see carbon fiber being used in a lot of equipment. So surfboards, water skis, kayak, canoes, rowing shells, oars. And what's important in terms of this conversation is that to date, no sustainable end-of-life solution has been available for carbon fiber. The reason carbon fiber is used is because it obviously combines super strength with being very lightweight and therefore is highly applicable to a lot of sport equipment. And also things like motorsport, where you want something that's very strong and very lightweight in terms of aerodynamics, but also because it's used for a vehicle, you want poor heat conduction to ensure it's safe. That's why it's an ideal material for race cars. To date, it's been very difficult to recycle, but sport are taking action in this area to try and look at how there can be some kind of recycling or longer life for the carbon fiber. So I direct you to World Sailing Trust, who are looking to change this with their Carbon Fiber Alliance and the Carbon Fiber Circular Demonstration Project. So in terms of the Circular Alliance, the World Sailing Trust leads that alongside the International Biathlon Union, the International Tennis Federation, UCI, the International Cycling Union, sport equipment manufacturers, including Wilson Sporting Goods, Starboard, Scott Sports, and One Way. They are coming together to try and support some kind of disruptive program based on reuse of carbon components within the sports sector. So we can all applaud that and hope to see great results out of that in the not too distant future. Then also McLaren Racing, Formula One team this year, 2024, are trialing the use of recycled carbon fiber at the US Grand Prix. They are working with a composites organization called V Carbon, and they are looking to basically use cutting edge material, which is recycled carbon fiber at the Grand Prix in order to try and develop a fully circular Formula One car by 2030, which is one of their goals. And obviously they have commitments around a net zero and reduction of carbon emissions impact. So what we've covered there is a lot of information around what sport's doing around recycling, but noting very importantly that that's always encapsulated within a reduction, reuse, innovation perspective as well. A lot of the things I've discussed don't just sit in a production, consumption, recycling model. A lot of the stuff we've spoken about there around apparel, around food, around plastics, a lot of reuse and reduction sits at the heart of all of that and is going to be a really, really important. And we've started to cover some of the different angles of whether recycling is worthwhile. As a reminder, at the root, yes, of course, recycling is worthwhile, but please don't think about recycling in a vacuum. Please don't think that just because your organization sends stuff to be recycled that you can tick off your sustainability efforts. It really isn't as binary as that. And we do have to start thinking about this now in a broader way of how sport can help drive true circularity, true transformation. One stat I did just want to mention within this as well. I was at a Pledgeable fan engagement event recently, and Lorraine Whitmarsh, MBE, who's an expert in behavioral change, spoke to us about this importance of behavior change, which actually is a really important thing to mention within recycling, because what we're talking about really when we talk about recycling is changing behaviors, changing the way things work. And at the heart of pretty much all of that, it comes back to human beings and us changing the way we do things. So behavior change sits at the heart of all of this. And she referenced some research by Dr. Diana Ivanova. And essentially this research showed, as individuals, what options have we got at our disposal that will actually impact the climate crisis. Fascinating stuff, really, really interesting. And then recommendations off the back of that, especially in a global north, high income context, were things like living car free, taking one fewer long haul flight a year, moving your house being powered by renewable energy, reducing your consumption of animal products and moving to a more plant-based diet. So there was a lot of recommendations, but the top 10 recommendations all noted to reduce our individual carbon footprint from anywhere between 0.8 and 2 tons of CO2 equivalent per person per year. A really interesting statistic that came through in that work that Lorraine shared was that recycling saved 0.01 tons of CO2 equivalent per capita per year. So tiny in comparison to some of the other changes we can make. The reason I want to flag that is not to say we shouldn't recycle. We absolutely should recycle. It's something that we should be doing as the infrastructure exists. Again, this is coming from a very global north perspective, and I understand in different parts of the world, the infrastructure is not there to separate your waste and have it end up in recycling. However, just from that perspective, in terms of actions we can take, just because it makes a tiny difference doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, because obviously if we didn't recycle, we would end up drowning in waste. So it's very, very important. But I guess the takeaway that I want to get across from this is that you have to continue to ask questions. Don't presume that the recycling is happening, because while we're dealing with issues like contamination, the energy and resources needed to collect waste, get it to a processing plant, process it, recycle it, create new products, there is obviously emissions relating to that as well. We want to ensure that we're doing that and it's ending up in the right place. But more broadly, we have to understand that recycling sits as part of the waste that we have created based on our current linear and recycling economy. And it's super important now that we move into a circular economy where we fundamentally shift the way we think about products and goods and materials, and a sport that we play our role in helping drive that shift. Of course, recycling can reduce environmental impact as a whole, hopefully by people undertaking recycling, sorting their waste, whether it's at sporting events, putting things in the right trash cans and bins, socializes the idea that that's normal, and hopefully that contributes to thinking about the environment and therefore has a ripple effect around sustainable lifestyles. But while we continue to do that work for as long as we are in a linear economy, we cannot just continue business as usual on the basis that things are going to be recycled. It is now absolutely crucial to shift to refuse, reduce, reuse, and all of the different R's that I mentioned at the start. My big takeaways are: don't tick the box of recycling and think it's enough. Question the way you do things and question where that recycling ends up and where end of life ultimately will be, even after the recycling has taken place. And if you can, within your role, instead of thinking about production and consumption, recycling, try and take responsibility for this resource stewardship that Harold Friedel talks about, thinking about reconnection, refuse, rethink, redesign, reduce, reuse, repair, reshare, refurbish, remanufacture, repurpose, recycle, and recover. If we can all move into that mindset and take that responsibility in terms of the power that we have, I think sport can play a huge role in having an impact. So to recap, thank you again to the anonymous question that led to both this podcast and also articles and discussion on social media around this important topic about what sport is doing around recycling and whether recycling is worthwhile. I'm really, really interested on your views on this and also any other innovative ideas that you have around recycling. That's been this week's episode of The Climate of Sport Ask Me Anything. We've got a few more questions that we'll be covering in the coming weeks, but please keep them coming because it's really, really interesting to understand from you what's on your mind and what questions are front of mind. No question too big or too small for us to tackle Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Climate of Sport Ask Me Anything. Don't forget, you could submit your question, any question at all, about sport and sustainability through our email address, which is hello@climateofsport.com. You can also submit your question through our website, www.sportpositive.org/podcast, or DM us on our social media pages, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter or X. If you don't wish us to read out your name, please just write the word anonymous at the top of your message. If you enjoyed this week's episode and you'd like to get it every week, click follow on the podcast to get it directly into your playlist. And please do share, give a review, and comment on the social media coverage of this episode. It helps us share the message further. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.